Good afternoon. I'm Walter Fluker. I'm the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor here at Boston University School of Theology, and I teach in the area of ethics and theology. And I'm a 1988 graduate, PhD graduate of Boston University School of Theology and Graduate School of blah, blah, blah. I'm just glad to be here. And I'm also favorite because we're talking about one of my most interesting topics, leadership and the future of leadership, and what is ahead in this next decade, and what might these fine and noble people of generations past and present have for us. To get us started, I have two slight remarks. One is, I think we live in a culture that devalues memory. I often say that many generations, at least 2 or 3, have arrived on the stage of history without their lines. And it's a very difficult thing to watch someone without their lines, without a script. They're either highly improvisational or they are anxious stutterers in public space. And so part of what we hope today is because of the benefit of memory and history here at the School of Theology, what you share with us as panelists will give us some direction for the future. I also think that I wanted to get ahead of the curve. You know what I tell students? I tell them that the greatest challenge for leadership in the 21st century is to stay awake. You can't drive when you're sleeping. You should not dress when you're sleeping. I've seen that. But you certainly should not try to lead, right? And so we're hoping that this afternoon we'll have a chance to benefit from the wisdom and hopefully the vision of these fine individuals. I'd like to do my job and get out of the way. And part of that job is introducing our panelists. And I wanted to note before I get started that we will favor Dr. Patrick B. Reyes through a video because he's not absent. And we'll ask that he goes first, so that we can hear from him. And also, he's an emerging leader. But let me introduce the panel. The Reverend Dr. William Alberts, who is to my right, earned his doctorate from Boston University School of Theology in 1961. He is an author and minister grounded in prophetic and pastoral ministry. He regularly writes articles for United Methodist Insight and on the website Counterpunch. His book, The Counterpunching Minister, which I must read, who couldn't be preyed on, P-R-E-Y-E-D, couldn't be prayed away. Dr. Alberts is also author of A Hospital Chaplain at the Crossroads of Humanity. He's a diplomat in the College of Pastoral Supervision and Psychotherapy. He is the father of 5 children, 7 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. Hooray. He and his wife, Eva, live in Canton, Massachusetts. Let's give him a round of applause. I think he's waiting for you have to hold applause, right? Let everybody get theirs. The Right Reverend Ian T. Douglas earned a doctorate from Boston University School of Theology in 1993. He is a priest and missionary and the 15th Bishop Diocesan of the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, serving approximately 168 parishes and faith communities in the state of Connecticut. He has been a member of the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church and chair of the Standing Commission on World Mission. Bishop Douglas is past convener of the Episcopal Seminary Consultation on Mission and a founder of the Episcopalians for Global Reconciliation. Let's give Bishop Douglas a hearty round. Patricia J. Thompson earned a Master of Divinity degree from the Boston University School of Theology in 1986, which means we were concurrent, though we don't remember one another. What is she? She is currently a retired elder in the New England Conference of the United Methodist Church, where she serves 1/4 time as co-pastor in charge of administration and local church historian for the Walcott United Methodist Church in Walcott, Vermont. She also serves as historian for the New England Conference and edits a quarterly newsletter entitled The New England United Methodist Messenger. Let's give her a hearty welcome. And I hope the panelists don't mind, but in the Bible, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So we'll begin with Dr. Reyes, his video, and then we'll ask Reverend Patricia J. Thompson to speak, and then the Right Reverend Ian T. Douglas, and of course, last but not least, the Reverend Dr. William Albert. Ladies and gentlemen, it's all yours after the video. And I'll take my water. Troubles of the righteous.
Thank you to the Dean team, Dean Moore, Dean Stone, and Dean Hickman Maynard for this Distinguished Alumni Award. I think it's really cool. I'm really blessed to receive it. Thank you to the faculty who are friends and colleagues and mentors. Yeah, I'm really grateful to be able to do this. And I was asked to answer this question: what are the 3 greatest challenges that we should be focusing on the next decade? And in my work at the Forum for Theological Exploration, where we support the next generation of Christian leaders in the church and academy to be wise, faithful, and courageous, 3 immediately come to mind. Our climate crisis, what's happening with our world, we're destroying it. And I'm really nervous that not just in the next 10 years, but like my kids will grow up in a world that they won't be able to thrive in because of that climate crisis. So I think ministries need to be focusing on that as much as they can. And to me, I think, and related, the second one is how that disproportionately affects the poor, marginalized, and people of color, in particular in this country. In my work, I support scholars of color who are trying to address these things. As a Latino coming from Central California, I can already feel that out there, the kind of existential threat that Latinos are under. For example, just in Gilroy, my little sister was working that, and a shooter comes in and is trying to take us out. So we're under threat on a lot of different ways, both in the climate and socio-politically. And I would love for us to focus on that and to try to address these violent times for communities of color. Which brings me to my 3rd piece, which is moral courage. I think the church needs to find some moral courage. We're seeing it in the UMC. BU is a UMC school. Pew says it's 94% white. It's hard to say that you're progressive and socially progressive and not address the lack of diversity, lack of social progressive issues within the church. And I think if we can find our moral center and have a whole cadre of Christian leaders, like hopefully all of you will be, that we'll be able to address these larger issues in the church and the academy.
We're going to ask you all to
return to those, oh, there's one more video? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So I love Westerns. It's something about surviving in the wilderness, trying to get the bad guy, the quest for gold or glory. There's just one problem when I watch these films, though. It's that iconic wanted poster. Wanted, dead or alive. You've seen this poster, right? I mean, this is to signal to us, the viewer, who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, or who the bad guy is doing good things. But the wanted poster, for some of us, because in all of these videos is a person of color, Mexican or Indian, usually not brought in alive. So my question is this: what does God want of us who show up on these posters? Now, I work in communities of color, specifically with students and scholars of color, people whose histories and lives have been stolen by the legacies of colonization and slavery. And my expertise in these communities is vocation or call, or simply meaning and purpose. So I ask my question again: what does God want of us who are wanted dead or alive? Now, I think our texts, our sacred texts, have some really good answers to this. I'm a father of two multicultural, multi-religious children, so we often turn to sacred texts for answers. And we got plenty of stories to choose from. We could choose Moses surviving Pharaoh, Jesus surviving Herod as an infant, or Miriam surviving Egypt, Pharaoh, her brothers, God. Well, my favorite is Ishmael and Hagar in the book of Genesis. Now let's remember who Hagar is. Hagar is the handmaiden of Sarah, who's the wife of Abraham. And when Abraham and Sarah can't have a kid, Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham. Now she escapes this. She runs out into the wilderness, and we first see God meet Hagar in chapter 16 of Genesis, and says she escaped because they dealt harshly with her. This is the same phrase is used for how the Egyptians treated the Israelites. So she is running for her life. And as she's out there in the wilderness, God says to Hagar, I have heard your cries of distress. And then after telling her she should go back, which I don't understand, but tells her she should go back, promises her a son, Ishmael, which means God hears, and promises a great nation will be made of that boy. Now you would think a story like this, okay, good things happen. I mean, it's not Disney though, it's scripture. So she goes back, and by Genesis chapter 21, they're back at this oppression thing. Sarah has her own child now and tells Abraham, cast them out. So Abraham, the father of Ishmael, only gives them bread and water and sends them on their way. Bread and water. Can you imagine that? Your dad giving you bread and water and sending you on your way? So they're out in the wilderness. The bread runs out. The water runs out. And Hagar pushes Ishmael underneath a bush and turns her eyes to God and says, do not let me watch my boy die. I'm a parent. I can't imagine praying that prayer. Let me pause this story here. When I read this story, I know that boy. I know Ishmael. See, growing up in Salinas, California, it's a small agricultural community known for three things: John Steinbeck, lettuce, and poverty in the lettuce fields because people who pick that lettuce can't afford to put it on their table, and gang warfare. It's got one of the highest rates of gang violence per capita in the entire country. One of my favorite authors, Octavia Butler, in her Parable trilogies, makes a brief stop in Salinas. Her characters surviving post-apocalyptic California find three things in Salinas. They find books, John Steinbeck. They find water, and they find a gun. Now, she may have been writing fiction, but she was writing my life. Because at the age of 12, when my parents split up, my dad, Latino man, just the perfect dad got cast out of our house. And my mom invited a stranger to come and move in. Now, this stranger had all the markings of his own trauma, and the way that he dealt with it was abuse and addiction. And so being a young person, only 12, sitting there at my white laminate desk doing my homework one day, I realized it was going to be one of those afternoons. I could hear the stranger downstairs stomping around looking for someone or something to dominate. So for those of us who show up on wanted posters, this was my chance to be a good guy, or a bad guy who does good things. So I started slinging insults his way to protect my younger brothers. He comes upstairs and says, "I'm going to get you, you brown pow." We start to fight. This 6'2" man trained by our military, inflicting his will on a 5'0" little Latino boy. I knew Ishmael. Our fight ended with him, his hands around my neck, lifting me up off the ground. God, I remember calling out for my dad, who I imagine was like Hagar, was cast out into the wilderness, not knowing what to do in this moment. So here, right here, this is the moment that it matters to do vocational discernment. When life is on the line, this is when it matters. Who is calling you to life? That is my question. I knew Ishmael. This was my home. This was supposed to be my inheritance. I was supposed to be safe here. I was God's beloved. That's what I had been told. Lucky for me, the text moves on, so this is my story. I'm obviously standing here. So we have Hagar, who's placed Ishmael under a bush to die, turning her eyes to God, saying, "Do not let me watch my son die." And God responds. God has heard the cries of the boy where he is. "Go and lift up the boy with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And so God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And so she went and filled up her skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Now, something I didn't mention. That first time God and Hagar met, Hagar named God El Roy, which means God of seeing, or God of my seeing, or God who sees. So you have Hagar, who's one of the only people to name God in the Bible. It's the first woman to be named, given a dynasty. Out here, calling out on a God who sees and a God who hears. Ishmael's God hears, and God has heard the cries of the boy where he is. I think we got something special here. God hears and sees the cries of the afflicted where they are, and calls on us who are with them to come and lift them up with our hand. Now, my story didn't end that night either. I remember waking up the next day, sore from the night before, gathering my books, trying to shove them into my backpack, rushed downstairs, made sure my brothers were okay, get in the car to go to school. And we're on the drive to school, and I remember something. I didn't do my homework. It's amazing what the mind can do in these moments of trauma, that we can think and focus on things that really don't matter that much, like homework. And so as we pull up to the school, the principal who stood outside our school every single day was standing there, and I wanted to do everything I could to get by him as quickly as possible so I could find a small corner of the campus to get my homework done. And as I went by him, still sore, head down, I'm trying to go as fast as I can, I hear those words, "Good morning, Patrick." And I look up at the principal, and my eyes fill with water, and I cannot stop crying. And the only words I can get out are, "I didn't finish my homework." You see, I went to a special school, Christian Brothers School in Salinas, California. My dad had the wherewithal to call me to life, saying that education and faith can save your life. He placed me in the school because he had promised me something great. So I didn't want to miss out on this opportunity. It's one of the only Latinos at this school. As one of the only kids from my side of town, I had this neighborhood on my back as well. I didn't want to lose out on this opportunity. And the principal, seeing this broken young man before him, listened to me and just asked me for one thing. Can you give me a piece of paper and a pen? So I get my backpack, hand him a piece of pen, thinking, okay, this is done. I'm gone. And he writes me a note, getting me out of homework for that day. And after seeing me and listening to my story, he says, you know, Patrick, we want you here. Take advantage of everything we have here. Do sports, any advanced classes you want to take, extracurriculars. I was in the band yearbook. Anything I could do to stay on campus, I can do. I was wanted. So for every day for 6 years, I got dropped off at about 7 a.m. and left at about 8 p.m. So you can see the thread here, right? That God calls us to life. God hears and God sees and calls us to life. My invitation to you is that this isn't just my story. There is so much happening in the world right now. And whether it's poverty, abuse, addiction, racism, homophobia, we live in a really tricky time in politics. It's a nice way to say, hopefully this is timestamp for a lot of years beyond this. This is a tricky time right now, politically. For people like me who are in education or food deserts, this call to life extends to all of us. So I want to leave you with a few things. If you're like Ishmael, hear me when I see you, and I say to you, I see you, I hear you. Hold on one more day. One more moment. You can make it. God has promised greatness for you. And if you're like the Hagars in the room, we need you to see us, to hear us, and to lift up our head and carry us in so that we can do the work that God has promised us to do. The writer and theologian Howard Thurman is attributed for saying, do not ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come fully alive. And go do it. Because what the world needs is people who come alive. So as you discern the many thresholds in your life, as you navigate jobs, moving, as you think about love, because that's something we discern a lot about, and relationships, as you navigate family and toxic relationships, because that's also something we navigate. Ask these two questions. How am I called to life? And how am I calling others to life? Because after all, you are wanted, fully alive. Thank you.
I'm going to ask us if even if we're not taking notes I'd like to see the panelists kind of move consecutively, and then we will have an opportunity to discuss with them their thinking and others in an integrated way. But I would like to see the panelists complete their presentations before there are questions and answers and discussion. And we're going to ask, as I suggested earlier, the Reverend Patricia Thompson to get us started. Thank you.
Well, this is a little more formal than I usually am when I preach, but I usually preach for 20 minutes and I have 10. So, here we go. I believe that the three greatest challenges facing us in the next decade are spiritual, economic, and technological. I believe the greatest challenge we face is a spiritual one. Our country was founded on the principle of freedom of religion, the right for each individual to worship as she or he wished. And surely, though not all of those living in the United States at the time worshiped God through Jesus Christ or were even involved in any organized religion, I think the vast majority did. Recent statistics, however, show that less and less people are involved in any kind of spiritual community. And the fastest growing group in our country today is the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those with no religious affiliations whatsoever. When Jesus was asked what was the greatest of all the commandments, he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." In other words, the most important focus of our lives should be on God and God's love, and then we should focus on others next, with the focus on ourselves being last. And although all world religions would not use the same words, I believe that most any religion would ask us to focus on God first and ourselves last. Our God is a God of love. And when we live out our lives in love, as imperfect as that often is, we learn to put the needs of others before our own, to accept people as they are, where they are, and to be more kind, compassionate, understanding, and giving in our day-to-day behavior. When we put ourselves and our needs or wants first, it seems to be much harder to accept those who are different than we are in race, religion, gender preference, economic status, etc., as well as to care for the environment and the increasing problem of climate change. And thus, we tend to lose our moral compass. One clearly does not have to have a relationship with God to be involved in organized religion, to learn to put others before self. However, as those of us who have attempted to live out that behavior in our own lives know all too well, that is not an easy path to follow. In fact, it is very difficult, or a lot more people would be a lot better at it than they are. We all need help and encouragement, and sometimes even a little constructive criticism along the way. And though even within our spiritual communities and churches we are sometimes divided, as we currently are in the United Methodist Church, nevertheless, I still believe that one of the greatest advantages of being involved in some kind of organized religion is when that it is working as it is meant to be. A spiritual community can provide us with the kind of support and encouragement we need to be our best selves. I think one of the greatest challenges to our spiritual lives today is the economic challenge we currently face. When I was in college, we were fighting the war on poverty. 50 years later, we're still involved in a poor people's campaign. What has changed, however, is that 50 years ago, there were only a handful of millionaires in the world. Today, there are people making $1 million or more for their annual salary. Though we do not seem to have made a lot of progress combating poverty in this country, we have made great strides in increasing the gap between those at the bottom of the economic ladder and those at the top. And the larger that gap becomes, the harder it becomes for those at the top to understand the needs of those at the bottom. Ironically, one might think, logically, that the more money one has, the more an individual would have to share with others, and thus the more generous one would become. But somehow, it doesn't seem to work that way. Though there are certainly many wealthy people in the world who are very generous in their giving habits, that is not the case for everyone. Further, we've made little progress in being able to pass laws that require that the wealthiest pay their fair share of taxes, or to limit the amount of money the wealthiest in this country can contribute to political campaigns, and thus limit the power the wealthiest have in our political system. One of my nieces, who happens to be here today, recently worked for a member of the Rockefeller family, who shared with her that when she was a little girl growing up, she and her best friend used to pretend that they lived in the real world, and they would go grocery shopping. And I've come to believe that that is somewhat of a paradigm for much of the economic crisis in our world today. If you have grown up in an environment where you've never had to go to the store or buy groceries to put food on the table for your family because you've always had someone else to do it for you, how can you possibly have any real comprehension of how the majority of people in this country or the world live on a day-to-day basis? Of how many people sometimes must make decisions about whether to put food on the table or a roof over their heads or pay for medical care. And unfortunately today, it costs so much to get elected to political office, especially at the national level, that common ordinary people who may have a much better understanding of how the world really works often cannot afford to run for office. It is then left to those with money, but maybe much less real life experience to do so. And thus, the reason we've not had much luck in implementing campaign reform. Because it costs so much money to get elected, it becomes very, very difficult to refuse to take money from wealthy individuals or large businesses such as the pharmaceutical companies, the NRA, oil companies, or the many, many other special interest groups that then expect preferential treatment. Thus, the most vulnerable become even more vulnerable. Those without food, shelter, or health care, with mental health or drug addiction issues, or the great number of those currently seeking asylum in this country, to name only a few, to say nothing of those around the world who need our help. Finally, all of this is exacerbated today by the technological revolution which we have experienced in the last 25 to 30 years. We can now communicate with people on the internet in ways we could hardly have imagined 50 years ago, via email, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media sites. Ironically, again, however, the fact that we can communicate almost instantly with folks around the world, rather than drawing us closer together and making us a stronger, more caring society, has in many ways driven us further apart, resulting in far less face-to-face time with other human beings and fostering so many unscrupulous scammers that it is hard to know whom one can trust anymore. And no one seems to have the ability to stop them. Yes, social media sites like Facebook often help families stay more closely connected, and many older people use these sites to stay more attached to their children and their grandchildren. On the other hand, we all know the terrible negative aspects these websites have, as many individuals feel free to say terrible things to or about someone they would never say face to face. And scammers have managed to hack into these sites and steal individuals' identities and even their life savings. This less face-to-face contact with other human beings seems to have made it far more difficult to have empathy with and compassion for other people as well. Further, many sites on the internet seem to reinforce the negative and often violent behaviors of those who believe they are superior to or seem to be threatened by. Person of a different skin color, cultural or religious background, gender identity, or those with whom they just plain disagree. And it is now possible to buy almost anything from the internet, such as weapons, bomb making, spy cameras, etc., all of which seems to have fueled a wave of violence in this country and around the world. All of this tends to increase the focus that individuals have on themselves, leading us to become far less caring and compassionate about other people and their needs, and fueling the need that many people seem to have to act out their negative feelings toward others in increasingly violent ways. How to address these tightly interconnected problems is a huge challenge in our world.
Thank you very much, Reverend Thompson. The Right Reverend Ian T. Douglas, your turn to burn.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here and be part of this panel tonight with also such distinguished alums, so thank you very much. The question that was posed to us is, what are the three greatest challenges facing us in the next decade. That presupposes what we mean by us.
Somebody asked me that.
So I was then invited to respond to this question from my own experience, background, and current ministry. The first two challenges I will address from my previous experience before I became bishop in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. And the last challenge, I'll be very domestic to the situation of the church in Connecticut and in New England, a little bit large. For close to 30 years, I was blessed to be part of the larger world Christian community, both as a professor of Christian mission and world Christianity, and in work across the Anglican communion and ecumenically. So to begin with, when I think about us, I begin with a sense of the global community. I really begin there. We are such a small speck in God's good creation in this island, this blue island that we live on. So when I think about us, I begin with the globe. And here I'm in agreement with Dr. Reyes that I think the primary challenge facing all of us is the reality of climate change. If you believe the science, which I sure do, and specifically read such authorities as NASA, NASA has identified the results of climate change and the ongoing disaster that we are living with under 7 immediate concerns of change. One is temperatures will continue to rise. Temperatures will continue to rise. In the last 100 years, our global climate temperature rise has risen by 2 degrees. Now you might think that's not much, but if you go back to the last ice age, the total rise has only been 5 to 9 degrees. That's how fast temperatures are rising. In addition, this is resulting in frost-free seasons. Frost-free seasons will lengthen across the world, upsetting all of our agricultural and ways by which we provide sustenance for the peoples of the world. And correlated to that, of course, is changes in precipitation patterns, more droughts, more heat waves, and as we've witnessed just recently with the tragedy of Dorian, the hurricanes will become stronger and more intense. Sea levels will rise 1 to 4 feet by 2100, and the Arctic is likely to become ice-free. This threatens all of our existence, not just the small island nations of the Caribbean or the South Pacific. We are living on the edge of a global apocalypse. This is not what God intended when God gave us the goodness of creation. And that's a key concern before us as Christians that we miss and neglect at our peril. Related to that, both by climate change but also by human-made disaster, I would say the second concern is the increase of forcibly displaced persons around the world, also known as refugees and migrants. According to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, there's an unprecedented almost 71 million people living around the world who have been forced from their homes. Among them are 26 million refugees. 26 million refugees, and half of them are under the age of 18. There are millions of stateless people who have been denied a nationality and access to basic human rights such as education, healthcare, employment, and freedom of movement. And one person is forcibly displaced from their homes every 2 seconds, or 37,000 people per day who are fleeing their homes because of the threat of persecution. When we hear the story of our Lord and read our scriptures, we are compelled, as inheritors of the Judeo-Christian tradition, to be open to the stranger as God amongst us. Hospitality is a primary value of who we are. as Christians. And our Lord himself was a forcibly displaced person, if you recall, fleeing for his life with his parents, with the slaughter of the innocents after his birth. We can't neglect this reality. Yet, in the United States, historically, one of the countries that was the most respectful of and concerned with in the 20th century, the settling of refugees and those who were forcibly displaced from their lands. During the last presidential administration, over 100,000 refugees would be accepted into our country every year, often primarily working with communities of faith. In the 45th administration, that number was cut in half in the first year. Last year it was 30,000, and most recent threats, and I think that's why they're being used, particularly as we reflect on the migrants the plight of locking up families and children and mothers on our southern border. The threat is to go to 0 for next year. What are we doing as Americans and as Christians to live into that invitation, dare I even say command, to welcome the stranger in our midst as God welcomes us? So those are, I think, two of the great concerns before us as the world community, that us. Now I'm going to be much more domestic. I'm going to talk about the church. And here I want to talk about specifically the church in the West, and more specifically, the church in New England and Connecticut. If you believe the Pew research on the least religious states in the Union, all 6 states in New England are now at the top of the list, having been at one point in time the most religious states in the United States. Christians in New England, Christians in Connecticut, during my lifetime, and dare I even say while being bishop, have lost their place in the privilege of Christendom. I think what Christians, the challenge, and here I'll say the gift, because I believe it's a gift, that we Christians are being invited to consider is exactly that, the end of Christendom. Most mainline churches are declining from someplace between 2 to 4% annually. And at least if Christian leaders are like a lot of the lay and ordained leaders in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, that occasions incredible anxiety. As if the vocation of a Christian is to keep the church in business. It's not. The invitation, our baptismal gift, is to participate in the life-saving salvation of God in the world that we call the mission of God. God's mission is to restore all people and all creation to unity with God and each other in Christ. That's what we're baptized into as Christians. And so the invitation before us, the challenge before us, and I would say the gift before us, is for Christians to move out of an ecclesiocentric preoccupation with the church and begin to see ourselves as agents of, first and foremost, the mission of God in the world. And when we do that, when we make that shift from ecclesiocentrism to missiocentrism, then I think God will have of us and the church that God needs for the future. So the challenge before the church is to really accept and believe and trust that God's not done with us yet. And that God will have, and always has had, since the Incarnation and Pentecost, the church that God needs to be about the Missio Dei, the mission of God in the world. So the question is, are we going to be that church? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop. I was just ruminating on that. Thank you very much. The Reverend Dr. William Alberts, again, last and distinguished.
Well, I'm honored to be here too. Regarding the 3 challenges facing us, the first challenge involved re-examining the United Methodist Church's own mission statement, which declares, "The mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world." The statement continues, "The United Methodist Church affirms that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, and the Lord of all." Then these words, "As we make disciples, we respect persons of all religious faiths, and we defend religious freedom for all persons." Here, with an ecumenical tip of the hat, the church tries to have it both ways. How can you believe that Jesus is the Savior of the world and Lord of all, and make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, while still respecting persons of all faiths? If you really respect persons of all faiths, why do you need to make disciples of them? This contradiction is similar to another in which the church wants it both ways. Methodism's Book of Discipline states, "We affirm that all persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God, need the ministry and guidance of the church in their struggle for human fulfillment." Then these words, "The Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching." Rejection with a straight face, which is evidenced by the so-called traditionalists at last February's special general conference on human sexuality. But more and more United Methodists recognize that the ministry and guidance of the church has been the greatest obstacle to LGBTQ persons in their struggle for human fulfillment. Sadly, the seeds of imperialism is embodied in Christianity. A reported resurrected Jesus gave his disciples a great commission in Matthew 28, "All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded you." That assumed great commission has been used to rationalize discovering, invading, and plundering all kinds of people. A commission that I believe leads many evangelical, believing Christians especially to unconsciously rationalize and accommodate America's imperialistic pursuit of world domination, masked as, quote, "the global war on terror," unquote. An example is the reported finding that 87% of white evangelical Christians in the U.S. supported President George W. Bush's falsely based criminal invasion of Iraq. Certain evangelical leaders were reported as claiming, quote, "that the American invasion of Iraq would create exciting new prospects for proselytizing Muslims." These Christians were responding to Bush's own imperialistic faith. In preparing to invade Iraq, he said, "We do not know all the ways of providence, yet we can trust them." The ways of providence led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, triggered a vicious sectarian civil war in Iraq, gave rise to ISIS, and created chaos in the Middle East. Now, many people of faith opposed the invasion of Iraq in the beginning, some strongly, but American boots on the ground have had a muting, normalizing effect. Which brings me to the second challenge facing us. The militarization of empathy. The militarization of empathy that serves to normalize and perpetuate America's so-called global war on terror. The militarizing of empathy is especially seen in national newscasts that end with military families reunited briefly in surprising homecomings. Servicemen and women return to surprise their children at school, at home, at church, and their families in a variety of settings. These emotionally charged reunions lead viewers to cheerfully identify strongly with military families, and by extension with our government's global warring. or lead viewers not to think about America's endless warring. The result is a reinforcement of patriotic allegiance and amnesia. There is also the constantly televised presence and honoring of military personnel at sporting events with military flyovers on special occasions. Now, who benefits from America's global war on terror? Obviously, the military-industrial intelligence complex profits from unending war. A global goose that keeps on giving. Why do we need 800 U.S. military bases in some 70 countries around the world? Certainly, the war on terror is not to protect Americans. Some 7,000 Americans have been sacrificed on the altar of our bipartisan government's imperialistic pursuit, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. If our government were really about protecting Americans, it would bring our military personnel home to their families and invest in education, employment opportunities, and health care for all Americans, and use diplomacy rather than threats and warmongering to resolve problems with other nations.
Yes.
Morally outraging people of faith should be the militarizing of empathy, the hijacking and weaponizing of the universal religious ethic of the Golden Rule that is intended to inspire people to transcend sectarianism and nationalism and identify with each other. Now, the third challenge, our moral frame of reference should be the common humanity we share with all other human beings. Morality guided by human rights, not partisan politics or sectarian religion. Faith leaders speaking reality and moral truth to political and ecclesiastical power, not merely providing the invocations and benedictions for those in power. The 2020 General Conference awaits, offering the church the opportunity to actualize its slogan of open hearts, open minds, open doors. The militarization of America continues. The historic white-controlled hierarchy of access to economic, political, and legal power still dominates America's status quo, and an authoritarian, psychopathic president is now at the helm, denying climate change, threatening war against Iran, and exploiting the plight of migrant families at the Mexican border to whip up his white nationalistic base for the 2020 election. These and other issues reveal that the common humanity everyone shares should be the epicenter of the moral universe, not an evangelizing religion. Our religious founders and saints have different beginnings and histories, but all of us share a single birth story. And at the moment of birth, we are almost alike. Thank you. I'm not done yet. I'm just about done, but my daughter's in child development, and I got that insight from her. We have different faith traditions, but the same universal need to love and to be loved. We speak different languages but laugh alike. We don't look alike, but our facial expressions tell the same story of surprise and pleasure, frustration and anger, joy and sadness. We sing different anthems with the same pride. We may regard each other as foreigners, yet we love and grieve alike. Anywhere in the world, wherever people are oppressed, their innate human response is to struggle for liberation. Thus, the common humanity all people share should be the frame of reference of the moral universe. And our common humanity is powerfully expressed in most religions' shared belief in the golden rule, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law of the prophet. The challenge is not about transforming others into our likeness, but transforming ourselves by recognizing the likeness we share with all other human beings. One last word. I believe that life is about finding one's own place and making room for others. My steeple has become the aspirations of all people. My altar, the common ground on which everyone walks. My cross, the oppression from which any individual or group is seeking to liberate himself or herself or itself. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This is wonderful. I was sitting there thinking, you always wish that you had more people present for moments like this, especially, again, I think that this idea of memory is related to vision. It's hard to envision future possibility without the benefit of memory. And your wisdom is the kind of wisdom that is earned out of experience. And for me, it gives hope. I wanted us to just for a minute kind of pause, breathe it in deeply, and for yourself, as we begin to think about themes that we've heard that we might want to discuss, or questions we have for the panelists, I'd like for us to pause and think about that. Just for a moment, prayerfully, because what's at stake here is far more than the idle chatter that I was talking about this morning. These are important times, and we need to listen deeply. Just for a moment. Thank you. I'd like for us to begin first by privileging the panelists if they have any need to interact with one another for a moment, had questions, that would be a wonderful way to start. And we can begin conversations from the audience. Are there any ideas that you heard from others that you will take away?
If I was to identify common themes amongst all the panelists, if I may, clearly not appreciating the image of God in the other, and thus denigrating and dismissing them in death-dealing ways is a constant theme. And then the second, I think, the lack of imagination and the smallness of the church to respond to that crisis.
Oh, good. Okay, my friends, I know you're thinking and breathing deeply. Let's hear it. Let's hear what the Spirit has to say to the churches. And if you're directing a question, please make it specific for one of the panelists.
My challenge as a Christian, and I claim to have been conceived in an Anglican, because my father's been an Anglican priest for 59 years, is why is it that we are hearing more of the voices of the evangelical Christian church that is embracing the racism and oppression and apartheid of the United States more, and we're not hearing the voices of those that are called to show the love of Jesus Christ in the world. And the greatest commandment of the New Testament is loving God with all our hearts and minds and souls, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. Why Why? And I just want to share a little bit that what is happening to children and people of color in this country and at the borders, and the, how do I put this politely? The insults that people of color have had to endure with this administration, with 45. I don't call him by name, I just say 45, it seems more palatable. It has really traumatized me and has actually scratched the surface of my post-traumatic stress disorder since I was born and grew up in South Africa and was born under apartheid. I don't feel safe, but I thank God because I always cover myself and all of us who are, especially all of us who are the other, the blood of Jesus. But I'm just, I just don't, it's really traumatized me. For the longest time, I couldn't sleep, and with all the violence that's happening, when we kept seeing the video of the president saying, I grab women by the, privates. I found myself actually doing this, just covering myself. And it's been a very traumatic experience. And why is it that we're not hearing more from the church about showing the love of Jesus Christ? We hear all about the ones that are saying, oh, I don't know, whatever they justify for voting him in. Actually, this morning I was listening to a Christian TV station, and one of the pastors said that, thank you, Mr. President, for having declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, as you had promised. And I had to change the channel.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? As we proceed, we don't have to do it seriatim. We can actually collect some questions or thoughts.
I think the previous comments lead to this question. How do we change the church from an environment of fear, because that's what we got, and our country from an environment of fear? And I'll give you a quick example. Years ago in the New England Conference, had a meeting in a high school, and Bishop Weaver was standing on the ice rink, if any of you remember that. We gave a 3% raise to our DSs. We complained about our lack of money, and then we proceeded to get rid of our 2 youth ministers. We lived in fear, not having enough money to continue our mission, whatever that mission was. How do we change it?
Perhaps one other question, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. And we're doing so well, people. I know we're in a room full of preachers, and I know my temptations to preach. But if you can, make it an interrogative, not a declarative statement, if you can. Well, good. Let's try this.
I'm not sure. But one of the things that I have come to the conclusion recently, and I'll say in Vermont in the last 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago, we had training on racism. And one of the things that I said at that meeting, and one of the things I've thought about a lot in recent years, is that we do not know how to talk with each other.
Amen.
About anything. And I said that day, and I'll say it here, how about this, the School of Theology. I've come to the conclusion that our seminary students need to have a course
in conflict management. Because someone in our churches needs to help people talk with each other. Before we can talk about how we feel about race, we have to be able to talk with each other about why somebody got pissed off because some new person came out. This happened in my little church. We had 2 old pieces of furniture that I had only ever seen used in a yard sale. And someone new came and, we're clearing things out, and she said, well, maybe we should take those to the dump. And everybody got upset because those 2 pieces of furniture were used in the Sunday school, which we haven't had in this church for probably 25 or 30 years. But nobody says anything in a meeting. It's said outside. And when we finally came to talk about it, I said to them, we've got to talk with each other, folks. I don't want to go home tonight and get a phone call that you were upset by what you said, but you didn't say anything here, because that will bring the church down faster than anything. But it doesn't happen because we think we need it. We need people to facilitate that conversation. We do it at annual conference once a year. We do it and someone said to me when I brought this up at the Reyes training, that's what we're doing here. Absolutely, I understand that. One session isn't going to work. And we can't expect that in our churches there's going to be a lay person who is skilled in doing that. And so, for my money, we need our clergy to be able to, but we don't do this in church. Why? We're afraid. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And, I just lost my train of thought, sorry. Because what many people want in church is a place where they can escape from all the chaos that we've talked about today. A place where they can be safe. A place where they can leave behind the violence and everything else. And I've said to people, well, I understand that's what you're looking for, but unfortunately our churches are made up of human beings with all our flaws. So I think we've got to learn how to talk with each other, because that's the basis of how we get beyond reasons from a piece of what I think. We got all these global things that we need to deal with, but when it comes right down to the foundation, we're going to talk with each other. And we don't know how to do it.
We'll just go down the list. I think the question, particularly how do we change the church from an environment of fear, is just right on the mark. And my answer would probably sound neither like an academic nor as an Episcopal bishop. And my answer would begin with the affirmation, the devil's not stupid. This fairly simplistic theological affirmation I would make is that the evil one, and I will beg people's pardon and use the male pronoun, he's not stupid. And I further appreciate he probably works on an economy of scarcity, because if the evil one worked on an economy of abundance, that would be of God. And the evil one has, as a result of that scarcity, only so many arrows in his quiver, and will go after that institution which is fundamentally called to be about the living, loving, liberating love of God in Jesus. And so I think the church is literally bedeviled. Bedeviled, and we are consumed with ourselves. And the loss of place, power, and privilege given to us in Christendom, whether it was economic, social, or political power, we are scared because we've lost that. And we're trying to claw our way back. And the more that we are trying to get back to some imagined place of privilege and power, as if Christendom ever did a good thing for the church. Speaking of your imperialism.
Not mine, it's a church.
Right. The point you made, right? It's a distraction from being focused on the mission of God. And so I think church leaders need to be less concerned about the church and more concerned about what God and Jesus, through the power of the Holy Spirit, is up to as far as giving us life and liberty and freedom.
I'd like to comment on the fear factor and relate that to conformity. In the Methodist Church, you have a hierarchy. And you can't have a hierarchy without a lowerarchy. Because the hierarchy determines people's placements, ministers' placements, and their progress. It's not just the church. You can go to any business like that that's hierarchical. And the power, the economic power that superiors in office have over clergy creates fear. And that creates conformity. So then it's like your superiors are keeping your conscience, the conscience of ministers. And it becomes important for the church to really develop a lot of transparency with that hierarchy. Where there's a focus, there could be an outside group studying the hierarchy and the lowerarchy and asking clergy the issues they have with the hierarchy. You mentioned one. There are various issues. And then you gather all this information together, and you've got an interview guide that then you take to the bishops, and you get their responses to it. And the aim of this is to humanize that hierarchy, lowerarchy, so that it's more human, and that bishops are able to see ministers that way, ministers are able to see bishops that way. But there is this conformity that, and so who determines? Well, usually the status quo, because the superiors in office are often guided by the status quo. And so you've got that to deal with as well. So when you get into theory, for me, it's conformity as well.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you. Are there other questions?
And that's why I'm glad I don't have power to move clergy.
That's it.
No
And that
responses to the conversation.
can be very abusive.
Gentlemen in the back.
I think
Dan,
there is some
front
hope for the United Methodist Church, and the hope is in some of our very progressive bishops in the Western jurisdiction, especially Bishop Karen Oliveto, who is the first lesbian to be elected as a bishop in the United Methodist Church. One of the first things she did was visit every parish in that jurisdiction. And I think there is hope, in spite of some of the pessimistic projections.
She's a great model, and the Western jurisdiction is pretty progressive.
Yeah.
I think so.
Well, we're the left wing of Methodism.
Here. Right here.
Are you proposing to unionize the lowerarchy? I mean, is that, it's partly in jest and partly because it sounds like you.
No, back in 72, 71 and 73, the New England Conference, it's called the Southern New England Conference, the National Commission on Religion and Race had an investigation of alleged discrimination in the appointment of a white instead of a black minister to Boston's racially mixed Church of All Nations. Now, the Black Methodists for Church Renewal pushed for that, the conference, to have this investigation. I happened to become chair of a group of clergy and lay people who joined with the Black Methodists for Church Renewal, and we helped to get that investigation passed. When you mention unionize, that becomes very important, but it's very risky because the hierarchy doesn't like that. I think there needs to be the humanizing that goes on back and forth between the superiors and the clergy, and however that can get done. Unionizing, I think, would be great. But then you change the power structure. Power structure is very important. And they get their power from being able to determine who goes there and who doesn't go there.
Yes, are there any other questions? We're gonna probably have time for at least 3 more that we can wrap up together. I see Emily in the back.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for all your responses. I was just curious if you could share some about your own personal practices of discerning next steps on taking on these challenges, because I feel like a big thing is like waking up every morning, and all of those challenges seem like the most urgent thing. And I know some of that's just like a personal discernment process, but I was curious what practices you have for kind of knowing where to start at the beginning of the day, given all of these very important issues that you raised.
Is that for me?
That's what.
Anybody.
What practices of discernment, what steps might you offer or provide for us to meet some of these challenges that you've laid out? Very practical question.
How do you triage?
How do you triage them?
I'll jump in. And this is really more personal practices rather than my church work. Because I learned long ago from a very wise person to whom I'm married, that the need to pay attention to God and take care of myself is paramount if I'm going to take care of anyone else. And for me, I am sustained in this work by spending a lot of time outdoors. I'm very privileged to live in a beautiful place. I eat breakfast every day, almost of the year, outdoors. Shower outdoors 10 months of the year. And I'm blessed to spend a lot of time on the water in various kinds of conveyances. And then I also have a personal practice of physical fitness. I've been a CrossFit athlete for almost 12 years, and I do it 3 times a week, and without it I couldn't do this job. So spending time in God's good creation and trying to take care of the creation that God has gifted me is paramount. And I'm blessed to do both of those activities with my spouse.
I'm not sure about the question. Sometimes I have a hard time hearing.
So I can repeat again and then
I think I got the gist of it, I'm not sure. I would suggest having access to alternative media. If you want to find out different views on the issues that we're talking about and other issues we haven't talked about, there are various websites that are alternative media and they can be most informative because you get your mainstream media are often aren't going to be that critical of the U.S. government. And the U.S. government leaves a lot to be desired in terms of what it's doing to people around the world in our name. So I would encourage gaining information from alternative media sources. You can easily Google what they are, and then you can read them and see whether you think they make sense. I happen to write for counterpunch.
I've basically developed a regular time, and I don't do it every single day, but a time of what I call my daily devotions, when I just spend time quietly, sometimes reading, sometimes trying to listen, a lot of intercessory prayer, but it's my time away. In the good weather, since I live in Vermont, and I'm in my 70s, I don't walk in the winter, but I try to walk as much. And you know, I live in a beautiful place as you do, and just kind of let all of that settle my mind. So that, but it's important to spend some time just with God.
Thank you. I've received my cue from the back. Speaking of authority. But I did want to at least provide our Dean, Mary Elizabeth Moore, with an opportunity for closing remarks if you have any. And certainly I'd like to thank you, both Ray and Andrew, for inviting me to facilitate this wonderful conversation. I'm always delighted to be a part of the School of the Prophets, and it's so good for you to be present with us so that students who are here now, and I might add faculty, get a sense of what this thing is really about. Thank you so much.
Tell her that's
I think I'll pose a final question. I realize our time is up, but all three of you have suggested next steps that have to do with your way of life, which is extraordinarily important and rich. My question then, if we had a little longer, would be, what next steps in the way we live together as community? Whether it's local church, denomination, city council, service organization, or whatever it is, how might we live together as community to disrupt the patterns that enable us so easily to contribute to the issues that you've made? So I'll leave that as a question for all of us. I'm so aware, I think I'm going to just add one quickie. This is my last year, what the heck. But I think in addition to fear, I want to say amen to fear, I want to add two others, and that's struggles for power and scapegoating. Struggles for power are when one group wants power and uses an issue to grab power. Are scapegoats another group in order to build their power? And scapegoating inherently turns us away from the issues and turns us to hate other people. How can we live in ways that disrupt those patterns and enable us to live as communities that have the potential to effect the kinds of changes the three of you have put before us as challenges? And I want to say, Patrick, who couldn't be here because he's speaking for the Children's Defense Fund tonight, and for something with his job that he just couldn't miss. But Patrick has the same kind of passion that the three of you have shared and that we have seen. How do we live tomorrow? I shouldn't have done that. I don't normally do it. I don't normally take away from the people who just presented. But I want to say a huge, huge thank you. All 4 of you have brought perspectives, experiences, and depth of questions that are not going to let us go. And we are greatly in your debt. Thank you so very much.